Hey there, my name is Megan and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a spoiler-free review of An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. An Ember in the Ashes is the first book in a YA fantasy quartet, and the last book, A Sky Beyond the Storm, comes out on December 1st of this year. So the way that I structure my fantasy book reviews is I discuss the world building, the characters, things that I liked and things that I didn't like, and then I give it an overall rating. So let's go ahead and talk about the world. An Ember in the Ashes takes place in a world that is very dark and very brutal, and there are two different classes. The first class is a very soldier-like, military-esque class, and they are known as masks because they literally wear these silver masks that adhere to their skin and become a part of them. There is some magic involved in that, so they basically have these silver-like faces. Kind of reminds me of liquid metal. And then we have the scholar class, and the scholars are oppressed. The Empire invaded their land several centuries ago and began their oppression of them. A lot of these scholars are sold into slavery, and the masks do raid parts of the scholars' quarters in order to gather slaves together. The Empire is ruled by an emperor, and there are also magical elements to this world. There are beings known as augurs. They are immortal, and they are kind of like religious symbols, and they are able to prophesize, and they kind of help guide the Empire and the military. I found the augurs to be unique because you don't really know what their motivations are. You don't really know if they're inherently evil or capable of being good, or if they just kind of exist to allow things to play out as they were going to play out anyway. So I'm interested to see how the role of the augurs is developed throughout the rest of the series. Several centuries ago, the augurs prophesied that the current emperor's line was going to end, and there was going to have to be a trial in order to determine who was going to be the next emperor. So that is currently going on in this book. Now I'm going to talk about the magical elements to this book because it is a fantasy. I will say that the magic is not the main focus of this book, but there are elements of it that are present. For example, there are magical beings that are mentioned, such as ghouls, ifrits, fae, jinn, that are present at some points in the book, but we do not yet see their relevance or why they're important or how they're going to play into the plot, if at all. So I'm hoping that Sabaa Tahir does develop these magical elements more as the series goes on. Now I'm going to talk about the characters. So there are two point of views in this book, and it is told in a first-person narrative. The first point of view we have is Leia, and Leia is a scholar, and right at the beginning of the book, there are some masks that attack her family home, and she ends up fleeing for her life while her brother is taken captive by the masks. And Leia learns that her brother Darren was actually part of the resistance who was trying to free themselves from the oppression of the Empire. Determined to get her brother out of prison, Leia ends up partnering with the Resistance. And Mazin, the Resistance leader, tells her that if she infiltrates Blackcliff Academy, where all of these masks are trained, and finds out information about the upcoming Emperor trials, then they will help her save her brother and get him out of prison. So Leia, who's not technically a slave, allows herself to be sold into slavery and becomes the Commandant's slave. The Commandant oversees Blackcliff Academy, and she is known as being completely ruthless and brutal. She beats her slaves, tortures her slaves, and doesn't even see them as human beings. It took me a while to warm up to Leia because Leia is filled with self-doubt throughout most of this book. She is constantly calling herself a coward and not as strong as her mother, who was part of the Resistance and died when she was very young. So I feel like Sabaa Tahir set up Leia to have a very, very powerful character arc as the series progresses. So Leia is always trying to be brave and find a source of bravery within herself and a motivation for doing these things that are inherently dangerous. And I feel like she is a character that will have a lot of growth. Next, we have Elias, and Elias is a mask. He is a soldier at Blackcliff Academy, and he is an interesting character because he hates being a soldier for the Empire. He is one of the few masks that sees how violent and brutal this world is and what they're being taught, and the violence that they're being taught to inflict on others is wrong. And right at the beginning of the book, we see that he is planning to desert his position, which can get you killed. He already had everything planned to run away, and then he has an interaction with an augur that completely changes his mind. So Elias is one of those characters that is a good soul in a bad situation, and he can't really show who he is in that situation because he might be killed or scrutinized for it. Elias is one of those characters that carries a lot of power but does not use it for the wrong reasons, and I really thought that was refreshing to see. Early on in the book, we learn that Elias is one of these students that is picked to complete in these trials to become emperor, he and 3 other students. And these trials are very brutal and very violent and very bloody, which is something that Elias really struggles with. Elias is another character that I think will have a very interesting character arc. I feel like all the characters in this book were set up to have interesting arcs, so I'm also excited to follow his journey in subsequent books. Now I'm going to discuss the things that I did like. This book was definitely a very character-driven book. Because we're in first-person narrative and it is alternating point of views, the reader is constantly in the head of these 2 characters. We are constantly experiencing their inner turmoils. We see Leia as she is trying to summon her bravery. We see Elias as he is trying to combat a society that he was forced into and do things that he doesn't want to do. So I really enjoyed being inside their heads. I really grew to know these characters and care about them and what happened to them. And I thought that that was a big strength of the book. Moving on with characters, I really enjoyed the side characters in this series. Usually, in my opinion, side characters are often not given their own identities, but we had several side characters that were just really well developed. For Leia, we have a girl named Izzy, who was another slave, and when she was 5 years old, the commandant gouged one of her eyes out, so she wears an eye patch. And then we have the cook, who was also tortured at the hands of the commandant, and she used to be part of the resistance, and she is always warning Leia not to trust the resistance. And I found Cook and her backstory to be the most interesting of all, and I'm hoping that she's in further books. And then with regards to Elias, we have Helene, who is his best friend, and they just have a really interesting relationship that I enjoyed reading about, and I felt like Helene was a character that I couldn't always predict what she was going to do because I didn't know where her loyalties lied. And at the beginning of the book, we're kind of presented with the idea that she had made a deal with someone that would kind of affects the outcome of the trials, and I couldn't really figure out what that was. So I think that Helene is a morally gray character possibly and has more going for her than was initially portrayed in book 1. So she's another character that I'm excited to see her journey as the books go on. So one of the things I really liked was the side characters in this book. Another thing I really liked was, despite the fact that we have a traditional YA fantasy setup with regards to an all-powerful society oppressing a lesser society, and then we have a resistance going on trying to combat that, Sabaa Tahir really wrote the resistance to not be entirely trustworthy. And that was something that I really enjoyed seeing, and it was made very clear at the beginning that there were some characters in the resistance that had different ulterior motives, and I felt like it just presented an additional conflict for Leia, and I really thought that that was well done. And lastly, one of the things I liked was Sabaa Tahir's writing style and her prose. I felt like it was very pretty. She does use figurative language, but not overly to the point where it's detracting from the story, but she uses it in very clever ways to enhance the reader's experience and understanding of the world, and I really liked her prose. And as I was reading the book, I made a mental note that she's got really awesome writing style. So that's just a personal preference for me. Now I'm going to go on to the things that I didn't like, and I'm going to start with the pacing. And the only thing I didn't like about that was that it was just non-stop action. And I'm talking about the first scene of the book was Leia's family getting attacked by the masks, and then it just goes from there. There is really not a lot of downtime in this book. There is always something happening, which can get a little bit tiresome to the reader, and I usually like a build-up in my stories with regards to setting, the exposition, background, and then jumping into the action, and I felt like we started with the action and then jumped into the exposition. I mean, it wasn't terrible. It didn't pull me out of the story at all, but it was something that I wish had been kind of the opposite. Next, I'm going to talk about just how violent the world was. I feel like this is definitely one of the darker YA stories that I've read. There is constant violence, torture of slaves, sexual assault. It's not graphic, but it is there. And it was to the point where I wondered if it was a bit overdone. And there were just instances where it's like, okay, you're being faced with killing all of these people and your best friend and other soldiers at Black Cliff Academy. If you're constantly pitting your own soldiers against one another, are you going to have any soldiers left for your empire? There were just situations that I didn't understand. You know, I could understand violence towards other people, but just pitting your own soldiers against one another just seemed really illogical. And I just didn't understand it. And that kind of pulled me out of the story. And this has to do with the trials, but I don't want to go into more depth without spoilers. But just know that there were instances where the soldiers were forced to fight and kill one another. And that just didn't make much sense to me because you're just weakening your army at that point. And my last disliked was the amount of teenage angst in this book. So I do like a fair amount of angst in my books if there is a romance presented, but there was a lot in this book with Leia and another character and Elias and another character and then Leia and Elias together. So there were at least 4 different characters that were all feeling angst, and it was just a lot to read about. And I understand that if you're a teenager, you're experiencing these emotions and you can relate to them. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have that in YA stories. Like I said, I like a certain amount of angst, but I just felt like it was a bit overdone, and maybe Sabaa Tahir should have just left the angst between 2 characters instead of having this like square of people who are having feelings for one another. So a little bit heavy on the angst, but not too heavy on the romance, if that makes sense. Alright, you guys, so that is it for my spoiler-free review of An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. I really enjoyed this book. I really grew to love the characters, and I'm very excited to see how the series continues, especially to see how these characters continue to grow. And I ended up giving An Ember in the Ashes 4.5 out of 5 stars. Thank you so much for watching. If you are not already subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and do so by hitting that subscribe button as well as the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I post new content. I post new videos every Sunday, and sometimes I post bonus videos in the middle of the week, and I will see you soon in another one. Goodbye.